Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Time of the Writer Festival 2022, the 25th edition of the festival, and I'm very excited to be with this amazing panel this afternoon. I'm here from Johannesburg, and there's quite a big thunderstorm going on, so please forgive the background noise if there is any. Without any further ado, I'd like to introduce and welcome the panel. We've got participants from Johannesburg, Cape Town, and as far afield as Boston this afternoon. First up, I'd like to introduce Buki Papillon, who's a Nigerian writer whose book An Ordinary Wonder was published last year. She's calling in from Boston and joining us this afternoon. Very welcome, Buki, and it's very nice to have you with us.
Hi, nice to be here.
Halligey is in Cape Town. She's has written together with Sara Matchett this wonderful book called Collaborative Conversations. It's a history of 21 years of the Mothertongue Project, which is a fabulous theatre project based in Cape Town, but really works all over the world. So I'm not sure where it's actually based, but it just seems to have its tentacles on every continent and very many countries. Alex is a theatre maker, a writer, and a performer herself, and has edited the book together with Sara. Welcome, Alex. It's very nice to have you with us today.
Thanks, Tracey. And I'm in Joburg.
Oh, in Joburg, sorry.
So pleased to be here. Thank you.
Thanks. And then Sara Matchett, who's the co-founder of the Mothertongue Project. She's currently a lecturer at UCT at the Centre for Theatre, Dance and Performance Studies, and also works a lot in the Fitzmaurice voice method, does many wonderful things as a director, a performer herself. She's joining us from Cape Town. Thank you very much for being with us, Sara.
Thank you, Tracey, and hello, everyone.
And last but not least, Uvile, who's joining us from, you're also in Johannesburg, Uvile? She also published a book last year, so all three of these books were published in 2021. Her book, Dreaming in Colour, was published by Mojaji Books. Welcome, and thank you very much for joining us today, Uvile.
Hi, Tracey. Thank you for having me.
So I'm going to open up the panel. The title of the panel is Politics and Gender, Reframing the Relationship. And I think for all of us, it was quite a difficult kind of opening gambit. But I think to start off with, I'd just like to ask each one of you if you in turn would speak about what you think the current relationship is between sexuality and politics, obviously related to your work, and where you find that sitting now in the discourse as opposed to where it was, say 10 years ago. If I could start with you, Buki.
Hi, everyone. Happy to be here. So my book, An Ordinary Wonder, was published last year in the UK and in the US as well. And clearly it does engage with the subject of gender and sexuality in Nigeria specifically, which is why I'm on this panel and very privileged to be on this panel. So yes, so the relationship between sexuality and politics in Nigeria, I can speak specifically more to Nigeria. I grew up there for a while before I moved to the UK to study law, and then I moved to the US. And so I would start from the angle that sexuality is legislated upon and definitely politicized in Nigeria. When I was growing up there, it wasn't even, sexuality wasn't a topic of debate at all, as in anything other than the prevailing gender binary, and being heterosexual did not even have words for existing, which is something that my novel An Ordinary Wonder explores to some extent. That whole idea that was prevailing at the time, that if something is considered, despite evidence to the contrary not to exist, then it follows that that thing would remain nameless. So once it does get named, though, then it must be legislated upon as aberrant. And that is the trajectory of the relationship between sexuality and politics, as I have experienced and understood it so far in Nigeria.
Thank you very much, Buki. And for yourself, Uvile, for writing your book, did you ever consider the notion of of sexuality and politics, and drawing on your personal experience?
Hi, definitely. I'd say the book is quite centered around ideas of sexuality. I think coming to one's sexuality and identity, and it's very much a coming of age of the main character Langa and her navigating and negotiating her sexuality in different spaces. And I think personally that's one of the biggest things that I'd say are notable in the relationship between sexuality and politics at the moment, is that there's an increasing visibility and language for sexuality, and an increase in spaces where the politics of sexuality, the politics of gender, the politics of self are being discussed and are being kind of brought to the fore, and spoken about publicly, and not as kind of hidden behind the scenes things that come up from time to time. So I think that's a very big thing at the moment in the landscape for me in that relationship. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Uvile. Alex and Sara, and the title of the theme of the conference this year is Moving Beyond Words, and I think nothing defines that more than the work that Mothertongue does. You just spoke now, Buki, about renaming the nameless, and I think what you do, Sara and Alex, both, is embodying the nameless and putting a body to what we don't even name. You actually embody it. Could you speak a little bit about your work and politics and sexuality and how that's evolved over the last? You've been working on it for 21 years. Maybe not do the whole 21 years, but do you find it's a different kind of relationship now between sexuality and politics now to what it was when you embarked upon doing this work 21 years ago?
Yeah, I think, we formed the Mothertongue Project 22 years ago now. It's I think in response to this very question, and the Mothertongue Project is a women's arts collective, and we found it necessary to create a space for women to be able to speak their stories. But I think just to speak to this question, or the relationship between sexuality and politics, I think that there's a toxic masculine principle that is at play in politics on the continent and in the world, for that matter. It's this toxic masculine that presents itself as absolutist forms of power on the continent and across the world. The invasion of Ukraine is one such demonstration. So when we think about a more healed relationship between politics and sexuality, the conversation of decolonization is central to this, because we can understand how colonial regimes and coloniality has reordered the indigenous gender identities and roles. For example, how queerness is deemed un-African in the post-colony. However, we are very aware that multiple genders and diverse sexual relationships existed before the arrival of the Bible and the gun. South Africa is one of the most progressive constitutions in the world when it comes to sexuality, but it remains progressive on paper. It's not embodied. It doesn't inform the lived reality of the majority of people in South Africa. And it's not embodied because of the systems of coloniality, because we've failed to address what redistribution and justice looks like in this country. And I think that that's something that over the years, through the work that we make, I think that Mothertongue responds to these questions as they arise. And yeah, Alex, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, sure. So, Sara, I think such a kind of compelling lens to understand it through and think through sexuality and politics, and particularly on the continent, but as you say, with global resonances. And Tracey, in response to your question and thinking in terms of what the Mothertongue Project their work over the last 20 years, it makes me think of Marcus's The Pink Line, which is a nonfiction journalistic book that he has released recently, which explores queerness throughout the world and this kind of political revolution we've seen in the last few years of putting queer politics up front and center and, finding platforms where it's more voiced and also it is more kind of rigorously and nuancedly discussed. And in The Pink Line, he explores, on one hand, a kind of globalized northern sort of sense of what queer politics is and the progressiveness of it, and then the day-to-day realities of navigating that in countries where governments or religious orders or cultural orders are see homosexuality, queerness as aberrant, label it as such. And this kind of navigation between these two worlds of like the globalized queer discourse and lived realities. And when Sara and I were talking through this question yesterday, I thought, the thing that Mothertongue does, which I think is particularly useful, is this creation of spaces for telling the stories. Because if you get down to the individual stories and you create a safe space where you're not feeling that there is any judgment or pressure to respond to either a sense of this is where I need to be politically or where I'd like to be in terms of advocacy, or otherwise I've got to protect my identity from discrimination, from possibly kind of violent legislation. But safe spaces where it's possible to really kind of talk about what your sexuality is, what your gender is, what you feel about it, and to workshop that and navigate that. And those kind of spaces for the small stories and the small stories to connect to other individuals, I think is where we start to really embody differences about sexuality and how it can be productively political.
Thanks, Alex. Really, and Buki, both of you, in a sense, following on from what Alex has said about writing the little stories, and by that I mean kind of individual and very personal stories. Often discussions can become very academic, and the way that people experience their lived reality is very different to what we read about in academic discourse. But I think with both of your books, you've managed to tell a very compelling individual narrative, which makes a topic, very real, and you relate to the individual you're writing about. So really, could you tell me a little bit about, in your book, Dreaming of Color, it's very much a coming out story, and not just coming out to outside people, but coming out to oneself. How you see that individual story navigating that terrain between sexuality and politics, if it does.
I think it's in so many instances actually in the book, and I think it's about the idea of single stories creating a greater narrative about sexuality and how we look at sexuality, because it's definitely those stories, like the stories of the character in the book. And in particular, the way the book is written is that it's a collection of different experiences of the character themselves, Ulanga, but also of people around her in this space that are experiencing their own expressions of sexuality, their own experiences of sexuality. And in those instances, there are very clear politics that come up, right? It's about the different spaces that she navigates. In the one space, she's at Rhodes University, UCA, and she's navigating her sexuality in that space in a time when it's RU reference list, and there are protests happening around rape culture and kind of masculinity and things like that, and those themes. And she's navigating herself in that space and trying to see who she is within the politics that are happening as the protest plays out, right? And it's the conversations that she has with her partner. It's the conversations that she has with her mother. It's conversations that her partner has with her family that bring up aspects like religion and how religion now comes into play when it comes to sexuality and family politics. So it's almost like the lived experiences themselves. It's like the personal is political, it's like the lived experiences themselves play out in such a way that we can look at the different layers of ourselves of the politics that come up without it having to be, an academic or because language is a very, very big thing, right? It can really exclude a particular group of people. So when we're now able to tell the story of this character in a way that different people can relate to, we make it possible for different people to have access to this story and access to the politics that come up in those different experiences. I don't know if that makes sense. So
yeah, it does. Thank you very much. And I think that the characters are also relatable, but the fact that it takes place in quite a political time at the university currently known as Rhodes also gives it another lens of politics. So it's like, many personal politics in the background of a really, violent political situation. Buki, you've said before in an interview that the one thing you learned from Octavia Butler, that she advised you to write stories that are full of facts. Your book, the line between facts and fiction, how much of it did you draw on your personal experience? And again, touching on when you wrote it, did you have an idea of it dealing with the politics of sexuality and specifically in the African continent, or is it for you telling that individual personal narrative that highlights the political issues?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, I think that it's sort of a little bit of personal experience, not personal experience in the sense that, I am not intersex like my character is, my character Otolorin, who is born intersex in 1990s Nigeria, at a time when most people, where there is not even a name for who she is, and who has to navigate so much in order to, and who is actually being raised as a boy, even though she feels in her heart that she's a girl, and how there isn't even the language for her to in any way be able to understand what is going on, and how society and her own family treat her as a result of her being born intersex. So as a writer, it has been kind of hard to navigate that space between what is lived experience and what people have maybe told me in confidence, and actually writing a book that hopefully presents these experiences in as interesting and as true a manner as possible, and especially from a conservative society like Nigeria, like many African countries, when it comes to gender and sexuality. I've had to sort of weigh the risks against the consequences of writing around certain subjects. So even though, like you did refer to that wonderful Octavia Butler quote, I try and change things around so that the essence of the story remains there, though the particulars are so blurred or so patchworked that nothing can be used to point out any specific person or place. There is this Church of Holy Fire, for example, where Otolorin, the main character in my book, is subjected to all sorts of horrors. And so the name of that church is made up, but that church is also sort of a compendium of many such places that actually do exist in Nigeria, where children are actually tortured in the name of casting out evil spirits and things like that. So, getting that, speaking the truth, telling stories that have the truth in them, for me, has been a little bit like walking a tightrope. But I've tried to do justice to the story that my main character really wanted me to tell.
And how has your book been received, both in Nigeria and in the USA and in the UK? What kind of feedback have you had?
Incredible. Just incredible. I mean, I set out on this journey with no idea. This is my debut novel. This is my first published book. So I sort of just hoped one person would want to read it. And so it has been amazing and really heartwarming. People have said it moved them or broadened their worldview. That in particular has been very, very delightful to me to hear someone say, oh, this really opened my eyes, or it really opened my mind. And when people say it encouraged them, especially genderqueer people in African countries, in Nigeria, when they say it encouraged them or they felt they could relate to my main character, all of that has been really incredible. And then when people just simply say, oh, I couldn't put it down, this was wonderful. And the response in African countries has absolutely surpassed my wildest hopes, especially, I mean, in South Africa, it's been amazing. And in Nigeria, readers are loving it. In the UK, in the US, the feedback has been incredible. I'm really very grateful.
That's fantastic to hear. Thank you, Buki. Sara and Alex, with both of you work with stories and with the real people telling their own stories. So there's not a mediated, you don't provide a written version of their story, but they themselves tell their stories. How do you find that does it make people feel more empowered? Do they start the journey with maybe being reluctant to share their story? Yeah, as Buki alluded to now, in some countries it's still illegal to express, whatever your personal form of sexuality is. How does that journey change for participants that you work with?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we've kind of experimented or explored both forms of storytelling, working with people's stories and then translating their stories, and working with professional performers to translate those stories. And at some point, I kind of thought, hang on, where are the owners of these source stories, and how can we incorporate the owners of these source stories into the performance? And the chapter that Alex wrote for the book actually deals with the project where we explored this in quite a lot of detail. So I don't know if Alex, if you want to speak about breathing spaces and what that entailed.
Yeah, and also I'm thinking of one of the first things you said to me before we started on the Breathing Space project in 2005, and which have continued to stay over the years, is that the real value of the theatrical fiction. So, that you create a workshop space where you invite people to tell intimate stories. And this feels very resonant, Uvile and Buki, with what you're talking about in your own works. You open a space for people to tell personal stories, either experiences of things they've seen or things that have happened directly to them. And that then, rather than doing a kind of verbatim telling, and I mean, and that's a whole school of theatre, is the verbatim theatre as a kind of activist approach, but to find a way of fictionalizing. And I think that's what Mothertongue has done consistently, and I think it's consistently worked as such a powerful tool for both honoring people's stories, but at the same time, not overexposing or not kind of feeling appropriative or extractive. So this work we did in 2005 in Darling, we worked with 10 women, all sort of middle-aged. There was one woman who was a teenager, and asking them about their daily experiences in Darling and the kind of the very sort of, still the town very divided along apartheid racial lines, and how these women were navigating that, and also just their ordinary everyday experiences. And we worked with them for 6 weeks, and there was a kind of core group of professional actors, and we would come back to Cape Town, we'd work with the women on the weekend, come back to Cape Town, and then Sara would facilitate us working with these stories we'd heard over the weekend and starting to craft some kind of theatrical material, which we'd take back to the women the next weekend and say, okay, well, this is what we've got. And they would feed in, and we'd generate more, and so it would go. And then we came to a piece where we were all performing together. So these women who had not done any kind of theatre work before, and the small group of professional actors. And so it was this thing of how both the kind of the narratives that we crafted, the play script, if you like, came from these real stories, but then was fictionalized, and how we had all negotiated that together. But then actually the embodied telling, the telling with us ourselves as performers was shared as well. So the women who had told the stories were part of this fictional reality that we had created together. Sara, do you want to add in there?
Let me unmute myself. Just another production, another way of working is, I think, something that I've been interested in over the years is looking at how the personal intersects with the archival, so to speak. So in the production of Womb of Fire, which is a piece that I made with Rihanna Abrams. We conceptualized the piece, and Rihanna's the co-founder of Mothertongue, and she wrote the piece and I directed it. And Womb of Fire looks at Rihanna's own personal narratives and how they intersect with kind of slave narratives and narratives of indigenous peoples to the Cape. And I think that for me has been an kind of really exciting exploration, is exploring those two kinds of narratives and seeing where they meet and how they meet. And in the meeting, there is almost, in the blend of the meeting, there's almost a third story that emerges. But I think this idea of the idea of working with the personal story, with lived experiences, and again, I think it's Octavia Butler who said, insert yourself into the story, you know, and I think that's absolutely resonates with the kind of work that Mothertongue has been making over the years, and different ways of inserting for our voices as women into the stories.
Thanks, Sara. I mean, I think what's very interesting in Womb of Fire is, you know, that kind of the notion of a woman's sexuality, and as you say, the archive nature of it, and how one can look at how a woman and her sexuality and how she was treated hundreds of years ago, and how that resonates still today, and how Rihanna, you know, kind of echoes that oppression still through, you know, to 2021 from the very early days. And I'm wondering if there was something in when you did that work that you felt, think carefully before I ask this question, in terms of the politics of her expressing her sexuality and how slave women were treated, you know, in the early days of the Cape, and how women are still treated in the Western Cape. And that kind of, you know, we talk about politics as if it's this external thing that, you know, is on paper and, as you say, has a very noxious and toxic masculinity to it. But the reality is women are actually experiencing those politics. Their bodies are on the forefront of the war. And, you know, how was that experience for Rihanna, you know, performing that and having to go back in her memory to where oppression kind of began from?
It's interesting. I think it's the method that we used to generate material was actually connected to my PhD research, which is around accessing stories that live in the body. And through my PhD research, what emerged was that these stories are not necessarily of this life, but they're ancestral as well. They're carried in the DNA, right? If we look at epigenetics. And so I mean, it's a long process, and I'm not going to go into the details of the particular method that we used, but we started with kind of the archival material, and then took Rihanna through a process where we accessed these memories that lived in the body, and she would what I termed free speak, and I recorded her, and these kind of her own memories flooded back, but they also were kind of memories that went back to her grandmother's memories, and you know, and it was a really interesting. And then she went and spoke to her mother about her grandmother and her great grandmother, and so it's a very embodied way of accessing memories that live in the body, whether they are of this life or of, you know, from our ancestors. And I think that it provided a container, I guess, for Rihanna to hold those stories and to discover those stories as well. And it also, you know, a lot of the writing of Womb of Fire also came from her experience. She underwent surgery a couple of years ago, and when she wasn't properly anesthetized, and she had all these kind of flashbacks and memories, which made their way into the performance. I mean, she wrote about that experience after the surgery, and then it made its way into the performance. So it was kind of the writing, I suppose, came from her own body and her body's memory, if that makes sense. So that, I think, the idea of women's, politics is embodied. It lives in the body. It's not something that's outside of the body. And I think it informs, particularly as women, it informs our lived experiences, on a daily basis.
Thanks, Sara. Uvile, for listening to Alex and Sara and talking about their theatre making experience, I wonder if you've thought of writing a play based on your book, is my one question. And then the other question, just linking to what Sara said about memories and, kind of archival. You've said dreams have always meant something to do with the future, the possibility or danger. Dreams are to be taken seriously. So that notion of that, what our thoughts and our memories and our dreams are what inform, our embodied experience. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that, and then also speak to the notion of perhaps, converting your book to a stage play.
I've definitely given it some thought, but it's I think it's a whole different mode of exploration. And I don't know if I'd want to write it myself, actually. Perhaps I would want to work with someone, or maybe even workshop it rather than create a written text and work from there, but rather to work actually, as Sara says, from the body to kind of adapt the novel. But I mean, I was listening to Sara, and I'm just like, I'm so fascinated with what she's saying about the Rihanna lady and her remembering her memories, and I'm actually interested in speaking to you about whatever technique you use there, because I'm very interested in the connection between kind of our unconscious self and how we navigate the spaces, like dream spaces, memory spaces, that world and that realm, and how it actually directly impacts our our actual physical lived experiences, although arguably those two worlds are not quite separate. So yeah, I think it's a very interesting place to be in, and it's something that inspired quite a lot of the book, as you've read from that segment. The book it's odd, but the book itself, it comes from, I feel it comes from dreams. It comes from my dreams as much as it comes from these experiences of these characters, right? And I think when we pay attention to, how can I put it? When we pay attention to our dream self, that self can really, really influence how we engage with the world and how we navigate spaces, how we create a sense of self. It can even influence your understanding of your own sexuality. So it was a very huge theme for me in writing the book. Yeah.
Thank you, Uvile. Buki, for you, your character, Arturalin, the notion of being intersex and her experience of dreaming herself into the world. Could you speak a little bit about that and how, essentially you've dreamt this character? How do you feel about embodying a character in your writing?
Yeah, I really enjoyed listening. I've enjoyed listening to everyone, and this whole idea of the dream, of incorporating the dream self all into the real self. This question of what is real and what is not comes up quite a bit in my book. And I have to say, this novel sort of found me, and the compendium of my own experiences right up to the moment that the main character whispered in my ear, "My name is Otolori." And literally, that was what happened, was that this character just literally, I felt like there was a presence behind me telling me my name is Otolori. I never even had to ask, because sometimes you have to change your main character's name or wonder, is this the right name? I didn't have to do that. They just came and told me that this was their name. And so one of the things that Otolori does in An Ordinary Wonder is to use that sort of dream world or dream state or escape into somewhere else. There's another place that Otolori goes to whenever life becomes too hard, or whenever she no longer has the tools to navigate the amount of oppression that she is undergoing. And this is a coming of age story. So this is a young person trying to navigate a world that is hostile to her and to the way that she wants to present herself into the world. And so there is this whole aspect to the book where Otto experiences a goddess who appears to her in her most difficult times. And this goddess is called Yeyemi, and she is part of the Yoruba mythology, the Yoruba ancestral worship system. And so there is this whole, so in order for Otolori to become her whole self, she has to sometimes disappear into this other world to go and get wisdom and strength. And then there is a sort of, there is some intergenerational trauma that my book also explores. And so we get to meet Otolori's mother, who is one of the main characters, and Otolori's grandparents. And so we see how, by the end, we understand how intergenerational trauma has informed the situation that Otolori finds herself in, and also how Yoruba cultural ways of being, including these alternative, I'd say alternative realities, play a role in helping her become who she needs to be.
Thank you very much. Uvile, I wonder if you could speak about, the characters in your book dealing specifically with a Black lesbian in South Africa. It's a very particular kind of political situation, and a very, for a lot of Black lesbian women in South Africa, a very dangerous situation to be in. How did you feel writing that character and taking into consideration the danger that women face in South Africa?
Actually, so Kwezi in the book identifies as lesbian, and Langa, who is the main character, identifies as bisexual, which is one of the spaces that they have to navigate within their partnership, and it's one of the spaces that exist where elements of violence, as you mentioned, do exist between this kind of lesbian, identifying as lesbian versus identifying as bisexual, and they can be very subtle violences that exist in that space, especially in partnerships, which is one of the areas of interest that I have. I mean, I wrote a paper on it, looking at intimate partner violence within LGBTQI+ relationships, and I think in writing Langa as a bisexual young woman, and in looking at the spaces that she then navigates when she's trying to understand, she's trying to navigate and understand who she is, right? And she comes to her partner who insists on her solely loving or solely having affection for women. And then she also finds herself in spaces where men impress a different kind of sexuality upon her. So it's a little bit more, it's a little bit more subtle in the book in that sense, because the violence that does come up in the book and the moments of violence that do come up in the book for Langa are not because of her sexuality, right? They're because of a number of other factors as well, but not solely because of her sexuality. So it was a very tricky space to try and navigate and to try and give nuance to, because it's not the story of every lesbian woman, but it is an issue. So it was very hard for me to find the balance between telling Langa's story in the way that I felt it should be told, but also not negating the experiences of other people, and finding the balance in giving the character the life that she deserves and not trying to tell a story that I feel is important. So there were a lot of questions, there were a lot of back and forths in writing the violence in the book. Yeah.
I feel like you've navigated that nuance very well. And with that question of nuance in the back of my mind, her name Kwezi, was that a deliberate choice? Kwezi being, a rape survivor herself and carrying that name in South African mythology and politics, carrying so much, of what it means. Did you name her Kwezi deliberately, or was it just that was just a name that you gave her?
No, actually, it was a thought that came after, but just like Buki, the names kind of the characters gave themselves those names. And I guess it was more a reflection on their characters, because Ulanga means sun and Kwezi means the stars. And it was a very distinct, like they just kind of came in that way, like were opposites in a very distinct way. But afterwards, after I wrote the book, then I was like, what the question that you're asking, I was quite shocked to see that was the name that came, and looking at it against all the politics that name carries in South Africa, I was like, okay, yeah, okay, yes. So it wasn't an intentional choice, but I now that it is written and the character is Kwezi, I think she does now carry that story as well along with her. Yeah.
I think it does. And as Buki was saying about her character coming into her mind and whispering, perhaps Kwezi did come and was to be named. One doesn't know. I think, we've spoken a lot about the politics and violence and quite heavy stuff. And I think one of the things we lose in politics and the toxic masculinity that kind of, gives the rules to what our sexuality can and can't be is the access to pleasure and the how everyone is entitled to that. And I think you deal a lot with that in your work, Sara, that kind of unleashing people's permission to engage in pleasure and feel pleasurable and feel happiness and feel joy. And that as much as politics can be about, kind of fighting for those choices, once you've got that, we've been liberated and we've got freedom, etc., what do we do with that? Do we have permission to have pleasure, to have fun? And I wonder if you can speak a little bit about that, and with the women that you've worked with in various projects, and if them telling their stories and either looking back into their histories and their memories, has it given them permission to find pleasure and to find joy in their lives?
I mean, it's interesting you say that, because I've just been thinking that the last couple of works haven't had much pleasure and joy in them. I think which maybe speaks to the urgency of the times, right? But if I think about the first couple of productions that we made, What the Water Gave Me, that was the production that launched the Mothertongue Project with Rihanna Abrams. We made the work in 2000, and then we made Rumor Fire in 2017. And I think even that, it was dealing with very difficult. This particular production explored personal narratives and how they intersected with mythology. And I think there's something about, the theme of this year's festival really speaks to what I've been thinking about. There's something about the relationship between memory and imagination, or remembering and imagining, and that opens up the space for healing, I think. And I think that's what The Water Gave Me did. Was Rihanna was able to kind of explore her own experiences growing up in South Africa, and how that intersected with the myth. And in that space of kind of memory and imagination and play, a great amount of healing could occur. And so the end of the performance was quite celebratory, and we invited the audience onto the stage to participate in various rituals, and there was a sense of, I guess, of a communal celebration or acknowledgement rather than celebration, maybe. And I think the same thing with Washamulo, a piece we made in 2012, working with older women from the continent, a woman from South Africa, from Zambia, and from Tanzania. And although the piece was dealing with quite heavy things, which dealt with the loss of mother, and all of the women had lost their mother. And so even though it was painful in a way, Makgat Mukwena wrote an African heroine's journey, which so the personal narratives intersected with this African heroine's journey. And the ending was also a kind of ritual. I don't know if it was celebration, but it invited people to participate and to commune, I guess, maybe that would be a better word. So I think that has, it's been something that has threaded its way through the work of Mothertongue over the years, this thing of engaging audiences in some kind of communal experience, some kind of way to connect, like really in embodied ways. And sometimes celebratory, sometimes joyful, sometimes also connecting through the painful resonances connecting us. I think that the project in Darling, Breathing Space, that Alex spoke about, was also quite celebratory in many ways, but also dealing with some hard-lived realities. I don't know. Al, do you have any other?
I'm thinking of that moment in Breathing Space where the three women in the lounge start dancing to 1,000 Beautiful Things and looking at their belly buttons. Yeah, and it was this sort of, the play was in 3 segments, and this particular segment, it had dealt with kind of infidelity and domestic violence. It was heavy, the topic, but the resolution, well, not the resolution, but the kind of poetic ending of the scene was these 3 women just dancing. And I think there's been so much of that in all the works, the poetry and things being beautiful, even if they're hard. There's the crafting of something beautiful, which is redemptive of the people who have had the difficult experiences or going through the hardships.
And also, I must say, we work with a youth theatre company in the Langeberg region, which is about 170 kilometers outside of the city, in a rural wine growing area. And we make baby theatre. We make theatre for babies. There's much joy in that, And so I think, yes, there is a lot of joy in the work we make, because we don't only, we work in multiple different contexts.
Thanks, Sara. Buki, for you and your character's journey, the moments of pleasure and the moments of joy, how did you navigate finding those in a story that has sometimes got some really dark aspects to it?
Yeah, I think the way that the light has come through in this book has been because of Otto Luring, the main character's own resilience, her sense of humor. She's witty, she's smart, she's very loving. And so I think all of these things, and especially I use things like proverbs and African and Nigerian sayings and songs and poems. So it's all woven through with African mythologies. There is for example, there's a Ghanaian art teacher who talks about Ghanaian art, and so they're just all these other things. So it's not Otto Luring is going through hard things, but the book is not about the hard things. The book is about Otto Luring's becoming a full, complete human being, and in the process of trying also to navigate to becoming to navigate her life, to live her life as the gender that she wants to be. So while that particular aspect of the book, of the story, has some quite heavy and difficult parts, the rest of it, the growing up, because this is a teenager in Nigeria just exploring, like any other teenager wants to explore life. So there are all these other aspects in the book of Otto. In the book, she's called Otto, but she wants to be called Lori, and eventually she becomes Otto Luring, Otto and Lori all together. So she's just really a teenager navigating life, making friends, going to school, trying to pass exams, falling out with her twin sister. So there are all those other things that are happening in the book that actually bring all these rays of light and actually make it a really enjoyable read. And that has been some of the feedback that people have come back to me with is, oh wow, I really expected that this was going to be so heavy, but there were so many moments of light, and there was so much happening that was really interesting and fascinating, outside of what Otto Luring was going through, that those actually carried me through the book.
Thanks very much. Uvile, can you speak a little bit? We only have a few minutes left, but I wanted you to touch on your work with Assetej. Sarah's mentioned working with children, and with Kwezi with a coming out story, and Buki's character going through teenager, following a person growing up. How do you navigate these issues with working with young people in theatre?
I worked quite briefly with Assetej. I was doing a mentorship. It was a mentorship program for the development of a script that actually was looking at a young girl navigating the dream space, quite magic realism, navigating herself and kind of her discovery of spirituality. So quite similar themes in understanding the self and finding bits of your identity and learning yourself. So that's a very huge theme of my work, is, I guess, coming out to yourself, really. It's a huge thing in the book, even just questioning what this coming out is, right? But even in Dreaming in Color, I think the big theme is that Ulanga is trying to figure out who she is, and she's coming out of her teens into like her early 20s, going into varsity and things like that. So I find that stories like that are quite important. I can personally say that in my navigating of not just my sexuality, but my understanding of different things like gender, and even my understanding of my own spirituality, there were a kind of struggled to figure those things out because I didn't find myself represented in a lot of spaces. I didn't find stories for myself, for people my age, that were really just like, okay, we're going to tackle this issue. We're not going to make it rainbows and flowers. And yes, those are lovely things, but also just looking at who am I and where can I find myself and where can I find people that are like me and that are having similar experiences than me, and where are the stories for that? So that's my passion about writing or creating stories that represent that space of, okay, I'm discovering myself, I'm figuring myself out. So that's the work I enjoy doing and that I would like to continue, doing. Those are the stories I like. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Uvile. And I know there's going to be lots of young women who read your book and do see themselves. And I think the fact that you've written it and given young girls that opportunity is fantastic. Before we close, I'd like to just remind everybody about the titles of all the books of the authors that are on the panel. Buki Papillon has written An Ordinary Wonder. Uvile Ximba has written Dreaming in Color. Collaborative Conversations, celebrating 21 years of the Mothertongue Project, is by Halligey and Sara Matchett. And I'd like you all, just in closing, to just maybe just give a few thoughts about what your next project will be, and also just remind us where we can buy your books, please. And thank you very, very much, each one of you, for being here. The books are all fabulous, and I think they're a great addition to the canon. And it's just wonderful to have stories about different people in different places. And as you say, Uvile, books that young women can read where they can see themselves represented. So if you could start with you, Alex and Sara, and if you can just tell us where we can get the book from.
Yes, so first of all, and Sara and I are not the co-authors, we're the co-editors, and there are 9 other authors. We must give credit to all our colleagues, because it was very much a collaborative journey, this, with just Sara and I holding the process. And the book is available through Matchett Books and also various other booksellers. But if you're in South Africa, probably the best thing to do is go to the Matchett website and access it through there.
Thanks, Alex. Where we can get your book from?
Was that question to me?
Yes, I just wanted, if you can just tell us where we can get your book from.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I couldn't hear you for a second. I believe my book is available in bookstores in South Africa. I'm not sure exactly which one. I know that the Cheeky Natives website, I think they might carry copies. It's available on online in any store that sells books online. I think that's the cover of the UK copy. I think that's the same one that South Africa has. Yeah, so it's available online. It's available in bookstores everywhere. I believe there is a company that is publishing it in South Africa in paperback. I think it might be available in paperback in South Africa. Yes.
Thanks very much, Buki.
Thank you.
And where can we get your book, Uvile?
My book is also available via Matchett Books. It's all the major bookstores, and also it's going to be available soon in the US and worldwide.
Fantastic.
So yeah,
great news.
I'm excited about that. Yeah, that's
Great.
So you can buy my book.
Thanks, Uvile. Thank you very much.
Awesome.
Thank you to each and every one of you for your time this afternoon. It's been such an honor to be able to talk to all of you, and I look forward to watching more work that you create and reading more books that you write. Thank you very much.